But I think the problem in Belgium is that at the police level, which is of course essential, we do not have specialized people. There are some persons at the federal police who are investigating these cases, but they're not really trained to do it.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
Hi, this is Janet, and we're continuing our journey today around universal jurisdiction. This month, it's Belgium. Steph unfortunately couldn't join, so just as a reminder, which would usually be a Stephopedia, to folks out there who might remember this like me, about 20 years ago, Belgium was this kind of big space that everybody thought in the field of accountability, that all the campaigners were saying Belgium is going to be the one for universal jurisdiction. But since then, it's become a relatively minor player, in my view, but maybe I'll be corrected by the end of this podcast. So why did that happen? Well, there was this kind of broad law in the 1990s, which was known as a, quote, textbook example of absolute universal jurisdiction, unquote. So maybe similar to thinking back to the podcast we did on Argentina. And under that, there were some really interesting attempts to bring war crimes charges against some high-profile foreign diplomats. I think I remember Ariel Sharon, one of the Bush presidents, maybe even Donald Rumsfeld, who was then Secretary of Defense. But then there was this big diplomatic backlash, including US threats to relocate the NATO headquarters away from Brussels. And that led more than 20 years ago, 2003, to some amendments which restricted universal jurisdiction to cases with Belgian links or treaty mandates. And this reduced what they knew as quote unquote forum shopping. But that's 20 years ago. So what has been happening since? So joining us is Mathias Holvoet, a lecturer in international criminal law at the University of Amsterdam, and he worked on the prosecution of international court crimes cases at the Federal Prosecutor's Office in Belgium. Hi, Mathias.
Hello, Janet. Thanks a lot for having me. It's an honor to be in this great podcast. Thanks a lot. It's an absolute honor. Thanks.
That's very kind of you. But before we check my homework and see whether I made any sense with my highly journalistic summary just then, I wanted to go through a bit of other news with you first, because this is why Belgium really came into the news during last month, during April. It may not be strictly universal jurisdiction, but I just feel we'd be crazy not to mention it. So this bit of news is about the 93-year-old former Belgian diplomat who's been ordered by a Brussels court to stand trial for his role in the assassination of the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, in 1961. And that's even before I was born. So it's like an enormous amount of time ago. This is a war crimes trial against Etienne d'Avignon. As far as I understand, he's not accused of directly trigger pulling, but imprisonment and humiliation and degrading treatment. So, Mathias, take it away. This is such a long time ago, but how did we get here?
Well, I think the Davignon case is demonstrating a recent trend in Belgian criminal justice, I would say, where courts also start to look at Belgium's colonial past. So we had this case, so related to the murder of Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of Congo. We also had a case where Belgium court declared that the so-called métis practices, where children of Congolese mothers and Belgian colonial men who were living in Congo were separated from their mothers and put in housings. So this was also declared as a crime against humanity.
Métis, just to say in case anybody didn't hear that means mixed in inverted commas. And so the practice sounds very similar to things like Canadian residential schools. So this idea that tried to take children away from some kind of infecting blackness, totally in inverted commas, and make them quote unquote white. Was that the idea?
That was the idea indeed. So there it's not a case of individual criminal responsibility. There the Belgian state was held accountable for crimes against humanity. So this practice of separating Métis children from their mothers was declared as a crime against humanity. So this was the first example where Belgian courts were willing to see this as, declare this as a crime against humanity. I think it's also one of the first instances in general where colonial crimes are qualified as international crimes, as crime against humanity. And so now we have the Davignon case. So I think there were 10 individuals that were identified to be responsible for the killing of Lumumba and two other also ministers. It's also important to clarify that it's not only about the killing of Lumumba, but also two other ministers who were associated with Lumumba. And then only Davignon is still alive. And then due to civil party complaints that were filed with the federal prosecutor, with descendants of Lumumba, I think it's grandchildren that are involved. The federal prosecutor took this step to then indeed try to refer this case to the courts. And then I think last month, indeed, Davignon was referred to the Brussels Court of First Instance for war crimes. So it's not related to the murder specifically, but it's related more to, indeed, like you said, inhumane treatment, also the denial of a right to fair trial, and also illegal detention.
To me, it feels like, this guy's 93 years old, and we've seen plenty of examples of older defendants going on trial. So that's not so much the issue, but it feels very much like, you say several people were identified. He's basically the last man standing.
Yeah, basically he's the only man who's still alive that could be held accountable. Because at the time he was a diplomat in Congo. He was only 27 years old. But he was responsible for helping to transfer Lumumba and the other ministers to Katanga, which was a hostile province of Congo, but which was hostile to the Lumumba government. And there he was then killed. So he was indeed the only person who is still alive, the last man standing, who could be prosecuted.
Quick update from us on that. What should we expect? Is something going to happen this year, 2026, or will it take a while before we get into an actual trial? What's your prediction?
Well, there is still an appeal by the defense. I think we'll first have to see what will come out of that. If the appeal is denied, then I could expect a trial to happen by the end of this year. Because it's important to note it's before the Brussels Court of First Instance, not the Cour d'Assises. Because normally all these international core crimes cases, they go before the Cour d'Assises. And this procedure is way more complicated, takes more time. But because it's referred to the Brussels Court of First Instance, I'm estimating that it could be held by the end of the year.
Let's pick up on some of that stuff about the different kind of courts a bit later on. But first, I did that little summary on this big dramatic shift of 2003 when Belgium went from whoa to oh, never mind. Maybe you want to take that up and then explain whether Belgium does universal jurisdiction cases. Does it have a war crimes unit? How does it operate?
Yes, very good question. So, of course, Belgium was famous in the beginning of the century because of this, spectacular cases. But actually, there were no cases. There were only arrest warrants. We never had any cases. Then there was a huge diplomatic backlash. And then basically, Belgium decided to really limit universal jurisdiction. So now we see the trials we have, it's kind of extended forms of active personality, I would say. So where mainly the perpetrators that are on trial are residents of Belgium. All the Rwandan cases we had, they were residing mainly in Belgium. We had a case also related to the Guatemala civil war. And there the victims, there were 4 Belgian religious workers who were at the time in Guatemala. They were victims of the regime. So there it was passive personality. So basically that's the main principles that apply. We have, strictly speaking, still universal jurisdiction, but there should be like a treaty obligation, which says Belgium has the obligation to investigate and prosecute people who are on our territory. And that's what was kind of invoked last year when these Israeli soldiers were arrested at Tomorrowland. So there, I think the legal basis was the Geneva Conventions, which say, yes, you have to investigate and prosecute perpetrators that are on your soil. Because there was not really a Belgian link there. The crimes, of course, didn't happen here in Belgium. There, the link was, strictly speaking, universal jurisdiction. But I would say the core is really active personality or passive personality, these extended forms, so residence.
You've also mentioned that these cases are mainly happening at the cour d'assises and that they're often long and complicated. Who's bringing these cases then? As I understand, there isn't the equivalent of like what we have in the Netherlands of a team internationale misdrijven who are, pushing these cases. So who's doing it?
Yes, very good question. So I worked myself 2 years at the Federal Prosecutor's Office. And there, so they have a section on, it's called International Humanitarian Law. So in there you have a few federal prosecutors who work on these cases. So we have kind of a section within the federal prosecution, which is dealing with organized crime and also terrorism. They're prosecuting these kind of cases. But I think the problem in Belgium is that at the police level, which is of course essential, we do not have specialized people. There are some persons at the federal police who are investigating these cases, but they're not really trained to do it. That is the main problem in Belgium. I think it's the capacity and the knowledge, the expertise. There's a lot of goodwill, because I worked there myself. They're hardworking people. But what we lack is indeed the Dutch model. I think we should copy it in a way, or at least be inspired by it. And that's why we have a lot of cases stalled in the investigation stage. Because the federal prosecution opens a lot of investigations. So there is no shortage of cases. There is a lot of potential cases, I would say. But it's very difficult to get them to trial. Because there's basically, I think, a lack of evidence.
So you already mentioned one that got stopped in the investigative stage. That was what's kind of commonly known as the Tomorrowland case. From my perspective, this was one of the many cases that some of the NGOs who are pursuing those who may be responsible for some of the destruction in Gaza, individual Israeli soldiers who may have committed war crimes, may have committed crimes against humanity, depending on what can be proved. And a particularly important foundation there is the Hind Rajab Foundation, which I'm sure many will have heard of, and I believe that they have close Belgian ties. But that got stopped in the investigative stage. In your opinion, was this just a political decision to say, oi, let's not touch this? Or was this, as you might say, this was a lack of evidence?
For me, it was a political decision, which is facilitated in a way by the framework we have. Also, what happened in 2003 is that a lot of power was given to the federal prosecutor to decide which cases he or she will investigate and prosecute. When a victim's complaint is filed, then the prosecutor may say, yes, but I think, in my view, there are other courts better placed to do it. For example, another domestic court, or in this case, the international court.
Which international court? What were they talking about?
So they were saying, actually, it was kind of a case of reverse complementarity to say, because the ICC is investigating and prosecuting the Palestine situation, we refer the case to the ICC because they're already investigating and prosecuting. And the problem is that you cannot appeal this decision. Because, of course, you can criticize it in many ways. This is turning around the idea, the core idea of the ICC, which is that states have to first investigate and prosecute cases domestically. And especially, this is also a textbook example, I would say, these are low-level perpetrators. States are meant to investigate and prosecute these. But the problem is that when the federal prosecutor invokes this provision, there is no appeal possible. The Hind Rajab Foundation could not do anything to appeal this. But I think it's a problematic decision. There's also the result of, like you said, the backlash in 2003 that we have this provision.
Taking some other examples, you've already mentioned Rwanda cases, and I'm obviously curious why so many. I assume that's to do with colonial heritage. And I'm also wondering about Syria, Iraq, foreign fighters, and whether there is a lot happening there. Are there investigations and so on? Give us a tour d'horizon. Why don't you suggest what's going on in Rwanda and Syria, and maybe the contrast?
So first of all, why do we have so many Rwandan cases? I think, of course, there's the historical ties, because Rwanda was also a colony of Belgium. So we have quite a huge Rwandan diaspora. And of course, quite some perpetrators are residing on our territory. So that's an important reason why we have these cases prosecuted, and many of them, because of the historical link. But secondly, I think also, it's about evidence. And if you can get cooperation from the Kagame government, because it's, of course, mainly Hutu perpetrators. So, of course, here again, it's important to get evidence. And I think there is cooperation with the Rwandan government. Important cooperation, so to obtain evidence, to go on site. These are, for me, the two main reasons that we have the historical reason, but also the fact that there is cooperation on these cases from the Rwandan government. And also, I think maybe that the role Belgium played during the genocide, some Belgian soldiers were killed. For these killings of these Belgian soldiers, some persons were investigated and prosecuted. So that also plays a role. The fact that we left Rwanda then, and then after that, the genocide further unfolded, also plays a role maybe. So there are still trials to come on Rwandan perpetrators in the years to come. There are a few in the pipeline, from what I've read. So then, when it comes to Syria and Iraq, so let's say the foreign fighters cases, we had quite a lot of cases, but in the beginning, many of those were prosecuted as terrorist crimes. Why? I think it's partly there's also an institutional reason. So Belgium also had, of course, like these terrorist attacks. So we had quite a focus on terrorism expertise. Then I think also the choice was there, more like, we have more expertise, knowledge about these terrorist crimes. That's also why they were then investigated and prosecuted as such. And also in terms of evidence, it's easier to establish a conviction for terrorism because they're less, evidentially less burdensome. If they establish less elements, the contextual elements you don't have to establish, for example, intent to destroy, is always very challenging. So that's why I think even though those crimes could also be qualified as international crimes, I think they were mainly prosecuted as terrorist crimes. Now, I think we see a bit of a shift lately where also I think the Syrian and Iraqi crimes are being investigated and prosecuted as core international crimes. We had a conviction in absentia for genocide of a foreign terrorist fighter. So it was with Islamic State for the genocide against the Yazidis. So I think there's also, I think, a bit of a shift happening there where these crimes are also being prosecuted as core international crimes. Why is this? I think this also has to do with cooperation, international and European cooperation, because these, for example, the Yazidi case I was talking about is also part of a joint investigation team, which is happening in Sweden and France. So I think the evidence collected there as part of the joint investigation team, the idea is we will prosecute it as core international crimes. So we identify which foreign fighters were responsible, and then we will prosecute them both in France, Sweden, and Belgium as core international crimes. I think in the future that Syrian and Iraqi cases will also be prosecuted more as core international crimes. I think there is also a few cases in the pipeline.
There's one case that something that I'm going to be watching, I think, during this year. That's the Martina Johnson case. This is about Liberia. Where's Stephopedia when I need her? I mean, she's not here, so I'm going to have to do it myself. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Mathias. She's the first Liberian woman to ever be tried for international crimes. It was the Swiss NGO Civitas Maxima that really pushed this investigation. Martina Johnson's been resident in Belgium since 2003, but the investigation started only in 2012. Then she was arrested in 2014 on suspicion of war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is related to her role in the early 1990s during a thing called Operation Octopus. This was the siege of Monrovia, Liberia's capital. This was Charles Taylor rebels trying to take over Monrovia, which I don't think worked at that point. an estimated 3,000 civilians were killed during a short period there. And she's alleged to have been a frontline commander. But kind of running through those different dates, I think investigations since 2012, arrest 2014. Here we are, 2026, when something apparently is going on. What the hell? Why has it taken so long, Mathias?
There are two sides to the story. I think one side is also, again, the Belgian capacity, the resources we have to deal with these cases. And also, like I want to reiterate again, at the investigatory level. So there is not enough personnel available to deal with all these cases. So there's the Belgian side, but there's also the Liberian side. I think they were not allowing, for a long time, we're not allowing foreign investigators on their territory to carry out on-site investigations. So that's also, of course, that slowed down the investigation. And also then Corona happened, and of course, nothing happened at all. And then I think more recently, there has been other governments in Liberia which has been more open for foreign investigators to come to Liberia and investigate and prosecute, investigate those crimes. That's also why for a long time, I think this investigation was stalled. And then, again, like I said, at the Belgian level, there's so many cases to be prosecuted, investigated, but there's only 3 federal prosecutors and who also have to deal with other ordinary crimes. That is a problem, the lack of expertise at the police level to be able to more effectively and more quickly investigate those crimes.
And what should we expect to happen now? What stage are we at?
Yeah, we're at the so the case has been referred recently, I think last month, to the Cour d'Assises. So it's happening in Ghent. It's not in Brussels. So most of the cases related to core international crimes are in front of the Cour d'Assises in Brussels, but one is in Ghent. So I would expect that there would be a trial maybe by the end of the year or early next year. And then we'll have to see, because also a lot of witnesses have died in the meantime, of course, whether this case will still be strong enough to lead to a conviction. So the defense has criticized the fact that the case is not strong enough. Then witnesses have died. There's a lot of hearsay evidence, but how concrete is it? Of course, we will see what happens, but whether the case is still strong enough to lead to a conviction.
We've run through quite a few different aspects of what's been going on in Belgium. There's a bit of a red line through everything you say as well. Capacity is an issue. But would you also say that we are likely to see more cases? I mean, is the appetite actually building within Belgium to do more cases? Is there pressure do people want to see more cases that Belgium takes on? What's your prediction?
Like I said, there is no shortage of cases. So actually last year in 25, there were 90 or something investigations were open. So it is really a record. Also, for example, because the migration authorities, they refer more and more cases to the federal prosecutor to say, we have a case here which we denied asylum, and we think there might be some probability that international crimes have been committed. More and more, and then if you read the year report, the last year report of the federal prosecutor, yes, they cry what I said. Lack of personnel, lack of police. So I think there's a lot of willingness at that level, but the important level, of course, is the political level. And that's always a problem in Belgium. The Ministry of Justice is asking more money politically. We need more money. But then Belgium has already quite a bad economic situation in terms of budget deficits. I'm a bit pessimistic whether we will see more cases. There will be a few cases, maybe 2 every year. But I fear that in the long run, I'm not very optimistic whether we will see indeed this change, this institutional change, where we will have more personnel, more specialized investigators. I hope I will be wrong, but given that, this has already been said for years and years, that we need more personnel. And also we need to get rid of this assize procedure because it's way too complex and we need lay judges. So this has been said already for years and years, and I do not see any change. So I think we will have cases. We will have Martina Johnson. We will have some Rwandan cases. Maybe we'll have some cases related to Syria and Iraq. But for the rest, I fear the situation will remain maybe the same.
You kind of opened a bit of a rabbit hole there, and you also mentioned it right near the top of the podcast, the complexity of the Cour d'Assises and the procedure there. Could you elucidate that for us? What do you mean there?
In general, it's quite a complex procedure because, of course, you have to constitute a lay jury. That always takes time. It's not if you have to be in front of 3 professional judges. So that procedure is also taking cumbersome. It's taking time to make the lay jury acquainted with the complexity of the case, the crimes that are charged. So the problem is, and that you also, when you read the yearly reports of the federal prosecutor, that only a few cases a year can be tried because this procedure is so complex. And because there's a backlog, especially in Brussels, to hold trials before the Cour d'Assises. So that's why they can only hold, like I said, 2 or 3 trials a year. So this is different maybe if it happens in other cities, like in Ghent. The Martina Johnson case will happen in Ghent. So there it's less of a problem because mainly all these cases related to international crimes are mainly related in Brussels. That creates a backlog, and then also the trial themselves are complex and cumbersome because of the whole procedure. But you have to constitute a lay jury, and then there are absences. It takes time. Most of the time, it takes a few months.
We always wrap up the podcast with a few general questions. The first one is always, is there something that you wish that you'd had a chance to say that you haven't had a chance to say yet?
I've sounded a bit too pessimistic, but I also want to commend the work of the federal prosecutors and people who work there, because I've worked there myself and they're really committed. And things do happen. So I mentioned also the Guatemala case, which was also a case from the beginning of the 80s, also extremely complex to have this prosecuted. And I think, there was a conviction, also in absentia, but okay, the trial was made possible. So I also want to be, to highlight the good examples. And I know the complexity of these cases. I mean, they're many years ago, happening outside of Belgium. So I understand the complexity, but I think that it's a pity that the money is not better used and that the resources are not better used to really create a more effective unit for the investigation and prosecution of international crimes. Like I said, indeed, like you also mentioned, the Dutch model would be a good thing to look at. There's a lot of goodwill and a lot of also hard work behind it. So I don't want to sound too pessimistic, because it's also not fair to the people involved. I think there's a problem at the political level, that there's not enough investment in these cases. Because Belgium diplomatically is always very much in favor of multilateralism, ICC. In practice, the investment is lacking. That's a pity.
Yeah, I understand the instinct not to throw your former colleagues under the bus there, and to temper your critique. So we will definitely keep some of that in the edit. The second question that we try to ask is some sense of how you got to where you are. Did you have an absolutely straightforward career route, or was it really wibbly wobbly through lots of other choices along the way? Did you have a really strange job before you ended up with this one?
I was always very interested in international criminal law. So.
Oh, you're so boring, Mathias. Come on, you should have been a circus juggler or something.
No, so maybe I should have made Belgian beer or something.
No, you just drink it, I assume. But I don't know.
Yes. No, it's true. It's a bit boring, but I was a law student and I was just interested in international criminal law, and I didn't like tax law and anything else. I always liked international and criminal law. But that's not to mean that I never thought about another job. For example, I like music. I wanted to become a DJ. I like sports, so I like to become a cyclist. But I think intellectually, still my strongest point. I will say it like that. The intellectual labor is still my best. Where I can contribute the best to the society. I will say it like that.
Just to say that if you are enjoying this podcast and you'd like to give us a bit of extra support, you can head over to our Support Us page, where you can give us a tip, or you can follow us on Patreon, and you can download our newsletter. And we really appreciate everybody who gives us a bit of extra support there. And our final question is always, is there something you've been reading listening to or watching recently that you would like to recommend to others? It can be something in the field or something you use to completely get away from this.
Okay, it's a book in Dutch, but it's about Yugoslavia. I've read recently a history of Yugoslavia. Very fascinating. I want to recommend it to people who read Dutch. It's Yugoslavia, so in Dutch, Yugoslavia, by Johan de Boze, which is very interesting. The history of Yugoslavia and how we ended up where we are now. Yeah, I'm also personally connected to the region, so that's also why it's maybe more interesting for me, because my partner is from Kosovo. If you like history, I would warmly recommend it.
Great. I think I will strongly recommend that to Steph when she's back on the pod, because she is both Dutch and someone who spends her time in the former, because it no longer exists, Yugoslavia regularly. Enjoys speaking, which is what is now known as BCS, but when she was learning it, I think was Serbian. So she will definitely enjoy reading that. So thank you very much.
I'm learning Albanian myself.
Yes, I don't think you'll be able to communicate in that mutual language, but I'm sure in Dutch and English you will be able to. Mathias, thank you very much for spending the time today as part of our series on universal jurisdiction, and speak to you again soon.
Thanks again.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.